We spent a little time in this text last week, and I still think it's really important for us to spend some time in this text, which is the seminal, foundational, fundamental text on marriage, okay? This is Genesis chapter 2, and I'm going to start reading in verse 18, right? The Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone, and I will make a helper suitable for him." So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. And then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man, and the man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." Verse 24, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. That's Genesis 2, verses 18, and then verses 21 through 24. Now, it's in that last verse, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, that there's this one little word, one small word, that has within it a world that you explore in your marriage, starting the very first day, the day of the wedding ceremony, and stretching out for all the days of your life, and also all of the days of your parents' life. And that one little word in verse 24 is leaves. A man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. Some of you grew up probably in an era where the King James Version, or maybe you grew up in a church family where the King James Version was the dominant version that you had of the Bible. And so you recognize the language in which it says, "This is why a man leaves and cleaves unto his wife." You've heard the language of leaving and cleaving. What this speaks to is God telling us that in our marriage, in the eyes of God, in our marriage, we are leaving a family of old to be a family that is new. And remember what I'm doing in this particular marriage series that I'm preaching. I told you last week that I wanted to take at least this kind of creative entry point on the series, which is I'm pretending as if we're peeking in on a conventional or traditional wedding ceremony at the different moments that happen that speak to what married life is supposed to be like from that moment forward. And these moments that represent promises that a husband makes to his wife and a wife makes to her husband about what marriage is going to look like from that moment forward. And so that's kind of how we're taking it. Last week we talked about the word of welcome, which is a bit of a word as to why we get married, and we explored that last week. And if you weren't here with us, I'd encourage you to go ahead and take a look at that or give a listen to that on the website. We also have a new YouTube channel where you can go and grab some of the sermons and be able to watch them. But this week, what I find myself wanting us to peek in on, because this is an important thing, it's an incredibly important moment in the wedding. Really, it's two different moments that happen to speak to a very important part of our lives in marriage. The first one is what's called the Declaration of Intent. Now, you know what the Declaration of Intent is, even if today's the first day you ever realize this is actually called the Declaration of Intent. This is where the preacher turns to the man and says, "Groom," fills in the name, obviously, "do you now leave your father and mother to establish your own home with bride as her husband, to make a home where she will be loved and cared for as long as God grants her life? If so, answer, 'I do.'" Hopefully he answers, "I do." Otherwise, it's a very awkward wedding. "Bride, do you now leave your father and mother to establish your own home with groom as his wife, to make a home where he will be loved and cared for as long as God grants him life? If so, answer, 'I do.'" This is a moment that's called the Declaration of Intent. Sometimes couples aren't necessarily drawn to having a declaration of intent, but as best I can, I try to convince them to do this, because this is the moment, here's the moment in the wedding where publicly before family and friends, and most importantly before God, they are declaring that they are leaving, that they are fulfilling this idea of marriage of leaving and cleaving that we see in Genesis chapter 2, specifically verse 24. It's a really important moment. And then there's this other moment, and you know this one, even if you didn't know the Declaration of Intent, you know this one too. There is a moment which is the giving of the bride, in which the preacher turns to the father or whomever the bride has asked to walk her down the aisle and give her away. And the minister asks this question, and who gives this woman to be married to this man? And hopefully, or else again, it's going to be a very awkward wedding. Hopefully, whoever's up there will say, "Her mother and I do," or "her family and I do." Now, a lot of people don't necessarily want that sometimes in a wedding service, especially in kind of a politically correct thing. What are we, some antiquated society where there's been a dowry paid and giving this person away? And I always encourage people, you should have this moment, because what it is Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. It is a declaration publicly that we are leaving, and the family then says publicly and before God, you have our blessing as you go. All of these moments, the declaration of intent and the giving of the bride, are born out of just one tiny verse, Genesis 2:24. And it's that idea of leaving. Here is where the bride and the groom say, we are leaving to form a new family. And here is where the older family says, you have our blessing as you go. And here is where things get really messy. They can get really messy. You know, the bride and the groom who stand up there and say, I do, on the other side of the declaration of intent, it isn't very long before all of a sudden they realize there's a lot of complexity you got to figure out about it. What does it mean to not necessarily have mom and dad as I once had them before? You know, I often hear, I've heard this from friends and such, that, that first nuclear argument that you have in your marriage, what was it over? And sometimes it could be over what the other person is doing or not doing when it comes to a half-empty tube of toothpaste. I mean, it can get kind of silly. But a lot of times the first nuclear argument that happens in married couples are the arguments that start out with someone saying, you know what, Dad thinks that we should. Or, you know, I was on the phone with Mom the other night and she really thinks. And what happens is you're trying to figure out, what does this mean, the leaving? What does it look like? And quite frankly, what can add to the complexity of all that is because some of us have parents who are all too ready and quite giddy to once again pick up the mantle of being helicopter parents in our life and just hovering over us and constantly even wanting to call in or kind of butt in the conversation. Say, you know, I really think you should. Or you know what, it would really please me if you did this. And it gets messy, the leaving. Leaving is incredibly messy for us. And what happens is we find ourselves asking this question, okay, in the leaving in marriage, what changes and what stays the same with regard to our relationship with our parents? I mean, what changes and what stays the same? I want to start out really, first and foremost, about talking about what stays the same. Because quite frankly, I don't think, especially in this society, where I think a lot more people are comfortable leaving even than cleaving. And in kind of this individualistic, rugged individualism that we have in America, I think that sometimes we have no problem leaving our parents in the dust or leaving family members in the dust. And there's different reasons why, and I'll come back to some of those reasons in just a moment. But I want to talk about what might very well need to stay the same in our relationship with our parents and our marriages. And I'll get at it by this, really, it's the principle we're told in Scripture, both in Old and New Testament. That is, what doesn't change is we need to honor our parents. You know this verse in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. This is one of the 10 Commandments, and probably even if you didn't grow up in church, you're familiar with the 10 Commandments. And in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, God is very clear to the people of Israel when he says, you must honor your father and your mother. You must elevate them in your lives to a prized position. You lend them ear. You weigh heavily the things that they have to offer you in your life. That's in Exodus 20, verse 12. And what's very easy is for us to read that and say, well, that's Old Testament. That's old. That's, out with the old, in with the new. That kind of thing had a shelf life, right? Now, what's interesting, though, is we don't say that about thou shalt not murder. But when it comes to this, I would argue there's absolutely no reason for us to say there's any kind of shelf life to that, if only for this very reason. It's picked back up in the New Testament by Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 2. It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. But then he takes it a step further and says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment. And I love what Paul does here, because if you've read Ephesians chapter 5 and chapter 6, and the reading plan actually that Austin worked out for us had us in Ephesians a lot this week, that if you read Ephesians 5 and 6, you realize that Paul is dancing in and out of all kinds of people who are gathered there in his audience. In New Testament times, when a letter would come in, they'd be in someone's home, so it'd be young and old alike. They didn't have this idea of, and now the kids are dismissed. Everyone was in there together, even for the teaching, for the reading of these letters. And there is a moment where Paul says in verse 1, hey, children, you need to obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. But then he goes a step further, because it's not just for children, it's all of you. The language that's used here and the verb tense is all of you need to honor your father and mother. So I like to imagine this idea that there's a father who's there with his son, and Paul says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, and he nudges him and says, that's right, kid, obey me. And then Paul goes further and says, all of you need to honor your father and mother. And I like to envision that maybe that guy's father is with him too, not just him, and says, honor me. That what happens is this commandment from God is a lot bigger than just for little kids. But what happens is God seems to indicate by renewing this again in the New Testament and the idea of honoring being bigger than just strict obedience and adherence. God's saying there's not a shelf life to the honor that we should be showing our parents. No shelf life to it. And you ask the question, why is there no shelf life to it? Because it sounds really odd because we're adults, for goodness sakes. The reason why is because there is no shelf life in Scripture to the role parents are supposed to play in your life. I'm going to spend a little time here, and I just want you to hear this. The most extensive, at least by way of my own conviction, the most extensive teaching that we have on what parenting is supposed to look like is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And this is what it says. Moses speaking to the people of Israel and said, these here that I'm laying out for you are the rules and the regulations that God, your God, commanded me to teach you to live out in the land you're about to cross into to possess. And this is so that you'll live in deep reverence before God lifelong, observing all his rules and regulations that I'm commanding you. You and your children and your grandchildren. Do you hear how extensive that is? You and your children and your grandchildren living good, long lives. You write these commandments that I've given you today on your hearts. Get them inside of you, but then get them inside of your children. Talk about them wherever you are, sitting at home or walking in the street. Talk about them from the time you get up in the morning to when you fall into bed at night. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your homes and on your city gates. And then the next time your child asks you, what do these requirements and these regulations and rules that God, our God, has commanded even mean? And you tell your child the story all over again. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God powerfully intervened and got us out of that country. We stood there and watched as God delivered miracle signs, great wonders and evil visitations on Egypt, on Pharaoh and his household. He pulled us out of there so he could bring us here and give us the land he so solemnly promised to our ancestors. That's why God commanded us to follow all these rules, so that we would live reverently before God, our God, as he gives us this good life, keeping us alive for a long time to come. It'll be a set right and put together life for us if we make sure that we do this entire commandment in the presence of God, our God, just as he commanded us to do. It's interesting when we talk about the role that parents are to play. What someone wants to do in sermon series on parenting is let's talk about disciplinary action. Let's talk about the provision we do. Let's talk about the matters of money and inheritance. Let's talk about making sure they got 3 squares a day. All of those things are very important. But what I find most fascinating is when Moses is pulling these people together before they enter the promised land, he says, for those of you who are parents, listen up. This is why you are a parent. Is to lay out before them the story that will define everything in their lives, that it is the Lord their God that has freed them. It is to instill in them reverence before God. It is to help them navigate the complexity of the decisions that they're going to make, because there is a right and there is a wrong. There is a God-honoring way and there is a way in which we can trample upon God's grace and his goodness. And this is why you are a parent. Can I borrow a little bit from last week? Remember I told you that one of the greatest mistakes that we make in our marriages is that we often speak of ourselves as husbands or as wives and designated as friends or as lovers. But what I talked about last week and listened to the sermon is Ephesians 5 is very clear that one of our most significant roles is to be prophet to our spouse. And what I mean by that is to be able to speak truth to our spouse. Prophets often we talk about as if there's people who talk about the future. They talk most of all about the present. What is God doing? How is God moving? How can we please God in this moment? I borrow that same language to say as parents, don't think of yourselves just primarily as fathers or as mothers, but you think of yourselves as prophets in the lives of your children, because you are representing God to your child. You are teaching the immense freedom and liberation they have in Jesus Christ. This is who you are as a parent. And did you listen to the text in Deuteronomy chapter 6? There is no shelf life to that. I mean, listen to that. This is what you pass on to your children and your grandchildren. This is a constant cycle that even in the moment when a child is pulling away in a limousine and waving goodbye and trying to turn a house into a home, even when they have children of their own, you do not stop being a parent. You do not stop being a prophet. You are invited by God for all the days of your life to speak in the life of your child about the freedoms of God, about the directions of God, that it might go well with them. And that is why Paul comes up and says, there's nothing that's changed here when it comes to honoring your mother and your father. It doesn't have a shelf life, because if they are faithful to the calling they have, which doesn't have a shelf life, what they can offer you could be so life-giving, so you honor them. I sum it up this way: honor your mother and father, because if, as best they can, your father and mother are still honoring the call God has given them as parents, what they have to offer you could very well be life-giving. And so I say this by way of a principle: in your marriage, continue to humbly seek the wisdom of your parents and your in-laws. Humbly seek the wisdom of your parents and your in-laws. Now, what does this look like? I'll come back to this in just a moment. What does this look like? You know, let me give you an example of what this looks like, because, and I'll choose a messy one because it involves an interaction that I had with my father-in-law. Let's just be honest. Quite frankly, when you get married, a lot of times you don't know how to interact with in-laws. Sometimes when an in-law gives you certain pieces of advice, and it's a mother or a father, sometimes deep within you there's this little voice that says, well, you're not really my dad. Not really my mom. And so this is an example of something that happened with my interaction with Sarah's dad, Bob, and it is also messy because, quite frankly, it is an instance in which I feel like Sarah and I honored him, but didn't necessarily obey just the particulars of it. But it was a really humbling moment early on in our life and our marriage and even our ministry, as you'll see in just a moment, because what happened is I realized, and I still realize this now, that even when I'm 36-year-olds, I still act like I'm 16 sometimes with my mom. Okay, Mom, I hear you. Okay, we'll see. Or sometimes with Sarah, say, okay, Bob, I hear you. That's good advice, okay? I think Sarah and I will take it from here. I'm 36 and I'm still acting like I'm 16 a little bit. And I fight this. You fight this too. But there was this moment where Sarah and I were in the midst of a ministry. It was the second ministry that I've been a part of, and it was just falling apart. I shared with you my first two ministries went down in flames, which, again, you should all be really encouraged to hear that. Second ministry that I was involved in was going down in flames, and what ended up happening in it was we discovered the reason it was such a toxic environment is because the lead pastor at the church was involved in a 2-year. But here's the deal. When you're in the midst of that kind of situation and you don't know that, all you know is, man, things are out of control right now. And Sarah and I mean, we hadn't even been married a year yet, and I would come home and I would collapse in the stairs, sometimes in tears. I'm like, I don't know what to do. And I remember, I think it was like the trip to the zoo one day with your family where I was talking to your dad a little bit about it. And I remember her dad said, you know, really, Brian, you should probably stay there for a good 5 years. And I remember getting in the car with Sarah. I'm like, there is no way that we're staying here for another 5 years. And truth be told, we did not end up staying there another 5 years. That was the particulars of this advice that he gave us, and we didn't end up heeding it through our own debate within our own marriage. And yet, in the essence of it, I could hear the voice of God and the wisdom. Because what he's saying is, man, if you're going to finish well. And if there's any way that you can show grace, show grace. And if there's any way that you can leave this kind of situation not being quotable in the wrong sense or in a way that will diminish your ministry or any ministry you can do with that body of believers moving forward, then you do that. That's basically what he was saying. That's the essence of what he was saying is, would you just seek out the grace of God and what he might be trying to do in you in this? And I ended up honoring that. And I'm glad I honored that, because when everything really collapsed and everything comes out into the open about the affair that was going on, they call at me and Sarah and say, can you come back and help us right the ship a little bit? Guys, that would have never happened if I had left poorly. And it allows us to basically come together with a group of elders and say, how do we say the beauty of what God is doing here? But I sincerely don't know if that would have happened if I hadn't heeded the advice of my in-law. It's one of these things that happens for us is that maybe what I need to tell you, and this sounds kind of odd because you're an adult, for goodness sakes, but sometimes when it comes to the moments where our parents are trying to speak something to us, we just need to grow up a bit. We need to listen. We need to listen. Because what's important to me is that if Sarah's dad, for example, is trying to heed the lifelong call that God has given him as a parent to speak into our lives, if he is wanting to be faithful to that call, who am I to say, I don't really feel like I need to be faithful to my call as a son? And so this question for you, and quite frankly, this is a little weird. I go through this every night before I have to preach. I'm like, they're going to hate this sermon. It's not going to be helpful at all. And part of the biggest struggles that I have, I know I'm a really confident person, but the reason why is because when I look at a lot of you and I've interacted with you, I see a great deal of honor that you show your parents. I really do. I love that someone laughed. I'm not going to say who it was, and I know who it was. Is that even when we show honor, I don't know how proactive, or like how really direct and focused we are in seeking the guidance of our parents. Like, I'm serious about this question. When was the last time you invited your parents or your in-laws to speak insight and wisdom into your lives as a married couple? I know that might seem kind of awkward, but when was the last time you had this kind of carved out time where you said, Mom, Dad, as you've watched us as a married couple, what have you noticed are our strengths or our weaknesses? What decisions have pleased you? What decisions have concerned you? Tell us. When was the last time you did that? Because even in the moments, if they share certain things that in the particulars you're like, I don't know. There's some things my mom says that she's observed about me. I'm like, what are you talking about? But constantly my mom, in those really piercing moments, there's been moments where I'm like, I feel like I've stumbled into hearing the voice of God. Because she's answering her call. And I want to answer mine to honor her in that. Some of us need to do that a little bit more directly, a little bit more decisively. So, in your marriage, continue to humbly seek the wisdom of your parents and your in-laws. But I'm putting this asterisk, I'm shoehorning this in. I'm shoehorning this in because I need to. I want to add a word to those of you who are wounded by this idea, though. Because I know very well that some folks who are here are listening to all of this and saying, there's very little about this that I can resonate with, because quite frankly, I have chosen to exist within application based on your having at least somewhat of godly parents. And some of you here, quite frankly, could sit here and say, that all sounds well and good, except for the fact that my parents really never gave 2 cents about trying to be the kind of godly parent that's outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And I want to speak to that just briefly. And I don't mean to shoehorn this in as if I don't take this seriously. I take this very seriously, and it's why I don't care if it makes me go a little bit long on the sermon. I'm doing it for your sake. Is that I recognize that for some of you where it's a little less extreme, maybe you have a relationship with your parents, and they're good people, but quite frankly, you're like, you know what, they really don't care all that much about God or about Christ or about instilling that kind of sacred truth in us. But you have a good relationship with them. And one of the things that I have to wholeheartedly admit by way of application for you is, I kept this a little bit general, I would still humbly seek the wisdom that they have to offer you. Because it's been said a lot that all truth is God's truth, and that could range all kinds of things. There can still be a great deal of financial wisdom you get from them, marital wisdom that you get from them, life practices, home repairs, for goodness. I mean, it's a whole list of wisdom that you can get from your parents. And I would still encourage you to have moments in which you would say, hey, what have you noticed about us? Allow them into your lives a little bit. And here's why I say that is because maybe not necessarily in that moment, you're going to get earth-shattering, God-centered, Christ-glorifying advice from them. But what happens is, by humbling ourselves to seek whatever form of wisdom we can from someone, man, you just kick that door in just a little bit to maybe you playing the role of spiritual parent to them, as odd as that sounds. But a lot of times in the respect that is shown just in general wisdom, that maybe you can be parent to them who is still a child trying to figure out what to make of this whole thing with God. I'm not saying it's easy, but it might be an opportunity. And what I have to speak to as well is for those of you who have faced something that has been incredibly extreme in your life, in which, quite frankly, when you look at your mom or you look at your dad, all you can think to yourself, they have done nothing but to hate and to hurt me. I want you to hear very clearly from me, first of all, that I hurt deeply for you. I do. And I hurt deeply for you really born out of the fact that my experience was completely opposite to that. And so, yeah, in some way it helps me realize, man, if I could go as opposite of what I've experienced, it would be hellish. So I hurt for you. I hurt for you too because I had two parents, both my mom and my dad, who had terrible fathers. Terrible fathers. My mom was abused. So I hurt for you. And one of the things I would tell you is I know that maybe seeking the wisdom of that parent who has hurt you and wounded you deeply could be incredibly destructive to you. I get that. And in that moment, I'm not sitting there saying for you to walk yourself into a hurricane of pain. I'm not saying that. It might be healthy for you to keep distance from them. But in this moment, one of the things I would really encourage you to do, and it is why I have prayed to God that he would continue to bring those who are in an older generation into the family that is reunion, is that sometimes who we have as a father and mother who can speak that kind of godly wisdom into us, you will only find it in the church, and it's why I believe in the church. It's why I will say we need to continue to gather when everyone else is saying, I don't know if we really need to do this. We need to get together. We need to be intergenerational. And quite frankly, there are people here who are a little older in years than you. I'm not going to name any of you by name. But quite frankly, there are so many people that I think if you could just sit with them and allow them to be spiritual parent to you, it's the same kind of situation Timothy found himself in with Paul. And I hate that that might not be all that you have. But maybe we ought to strike the language that that's all that you have, because that's a lot. It's a lot. So I don't mean to shoehorn that in, but it's really important because I know some of you have been wounded by this, and I'm speaking often in a particular context, right? So in your marriage, continue to humbly seek the wisdom of your parents and in-laws, even if it means just general wisdom, or humbly seek the wisdom of those who could be your spiritual parents, your spiritual in-laws. But all of this falls in the context of an even greater idea and more important idea, that in your marriage you need to always seek first your spouse. We need to hang out in the language of Genesis 2 for just a little while here because it's powerful. Genesis 2, verse 23, and the man said, this, now Eve is standing before him, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Now that's the kind of language that we have, my own blood, my own flesh and blood, my family. This is Adam making a pretty decisive statement saying, this is my family. She is my family. We together, the two of us, are a family. That's powerful language there. Powerful, powerful language. In fact, I've often thought about this in Genesis 2:25. This is this verse that's kind of awkward for us. The second half of 25. Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. And I've sometimes thought to myself, I don't necessarily think that's just a statement about how pure and good and holy things were in that before sin entered the world. I sometimes feel like what God is making a statement there is that in marriage, in that relationship between a man and a woman who are married, it is as if they are being born again into a new family. You know, what are we when we're born into our family? We are born naked and screaming. And in this instance, really in Genesis 2, we're born into this naked and screaming, but it's a good screaming. It's saying, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. It's a powerful language that God uses in this text to be able to speak to the idea that a new family is being started. But this is important too. Genesis 2:24, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. And one of the things that is interesting, I'm not really all that great at Hebrew. I feel better about Greek, but in trying to study some of these words, what I found fascinating is the word for leaves really probably shouldn't be translated leaves, but every single translation translates it leaves because I think the people who were translating got a little nervous. Because how that should be translated, and this sounds like really crass, difficult language, is that is why a man forsakes his father and mother and clings to his wife. That sounds kind of brutal, doesn't it? But why I think that's actually important for us to see is because it needs to show us that this is a difficult but decisive and important moment. The language that's used in Genesis 2 for leaves and united is actually Old Testament covenant language. And a covenant is this idea in which I was once solely in relationship with this person in business or life or anything along those lines. But now I am in covenant. I'm forsaking that older covenant for this newer covenant. In fact, that word united is, they don't translate that the way you ought to translate it because it just seems awkward. Because what it should say is, that is why a man forsakes his father and mother and sticks to his wife. It's almost like they're just holding on to each other and forsaking the idea that that is their family. This is my family. It's a powerful thing when you bring together those two verses that in marriage, a new family is being born. And above all else, aside from the covenant relationship you have with God, you are in covenant with that new family. That is your most important family. And so, yes, as much as I look at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, honor your mother and father. What is the prevailing commandment before that one? Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. Husbands and wives, submit to one another out of reverence for Jesus Christ. What is first and foremost important in this, most important in this new marriage that has been formed is that you're submitting to one another. Because remember, as much as your parents play the role of prophet, what did we talk about last week? When you look at husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, that he can evoke her beauty, that he can present her as holy and cleansed before God. There is no greater prophet in your life than your spouse, parents included. What they have cannot be offered by anybody else. Karl Barth, the theologian, puts it this way: your nearest neighbor is your spouse. Listen to them. The person who knows you best is your spouse. Listen to them. And if your spouse is not the person who knows you best, you probably do have a lot of work to do. I say this too because of something that happens in Genesis. I love this. The Lord God said, it's not good for the man to be alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him. And now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky, and he brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. And so the man gave names to all the livestock and the birds in the sky and all the wild animals. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. It's just this kind of fun little moment in which, as if God is putting animals, say, is this going to help you? Is this going to help you? But it wasn't until God put the woman before him, he says, now this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And I think the issue that God is saying is there's no animal, there's nothing in creation that will ever match what your spouse can do for you if you are married. And that includes parents. Because when God went to create out of the dust someone to be a suitable helper for the man, it was not. And so he made him a father, made him a mother. He made him a woman. That's significant, isn't it? So first and foremost, that's what we need to pay attention to, is in your marriage, you always seek first your spouse. And what does that look like? First things first, I think this is what it looks like. This is mutual leaving, mutual forsaking. And I say this is really important because I've been in a lot of, really a lot of counseling situations, or I've even talked to my friends, and I've realized that maybe one spouse was particularly close to his or her parents. And so they'll often say, yeah, I know, but really my mom was always my best friend, and I get that. I'm going to put this bluntly. She ain't your best friend anymore. Your husband's your best friend. Your wife is your best friend. It's mutual forsaking that needs to happen here. See, that's powerful in Genesis 2, in which in verse 24 it says, that is why a man leaves his father and mother. A lot of people read this text and say, that's really weird, because in ancient culture, it was the woman who left her mother and father. In fact, half the time, they would go and live with the man's mother and father. So it's kind of weird to say the man has to leave his father and mother. I don't think it's weird at all. I think it's God making a really strong statement. That it's already assumed in that society that a woman is leaving her father and mother to go and live with the man and practically his family. But then God says, but that's why a man leaves his mother and father. Do you see how he makes it mutual? And he collapses the basic structure there that had been presented to them by culture and says, no, you're both leaving. You're both clinging to one another. There's no kind of holdover and say, well, that's okay if you're a little bit more closer than I am and all this. No, it's mutual forsaking. It's mutual leaving. Then also what it comes down to, and this is very basic application. There's certain things that I know this is just very different for all of you. But what I think this comes down to from a very base level is your first conversation about any weighty matter in life is always with your spouse. Always. always. If your first call about something significant of life, especially that's involving your husband, is your mom or your dad, that needs to stop. If your first call, whenever you're making some major decision that's going to impact your marriage and it's all of a sudden been dropped in your life and you've not had a chance to talk to your wife yet, and your first call is to talk to your dad or your mom, that needs to stop. And I'm saying this as someone, quite frankly, and being very close to my dad. How many different times, my dad used to be my first call. Well, Sarah's my first call. Every time. And this goes further than even parents. This goes to grandparents. This goes to aunts and uncles. This goes to best friends. I don't know how to say it, but I talk to her about everything because she's like a sister to me. First call about any weighty matter, first conversation, first email if you need to be, is to your spouse. And the reason I say that is because Matthew 18 does not just apply to general relationships, it applies to marriage. Remember Matthew 18, we talked about this when we were going through the Gospel of Matthew. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along. This is Matthew 18, 15, and 16. Can I just give that a marriage spin? If your spouse sins, first go to them and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not, listen, maybe give mom or dad a call. Maybe. If your spouse is stagnant in their relationship with God, first go to them and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, maybe give mom or dad a call. Maybe. If you and your spouse are having difficulty making a critical decision, first go to your spouse just between the two of you. And if you reach an impasse, maybe give mom or dad a call. I'm trying to bring my point home here. Because what often happens, Gary Chapman talks about this a lot in his books on marriage, is that he said time and time and time again in his counseling situations, he has had a spouse who comes in complaining to them about their spouse, and he asks them who they have spoken to. If they've spoken to their spouse, they will often say no, or I brought it up a while ago, and we weren't able to untangle it all, so now I'm just mad. And then they'll say, who else have you talked about this with? I've talked about it with my mom, or I've talked about it with my dad. And he said, on the other side of working things out, do you go back to your mom and dad and explain to them how things have gotten better? Well, not always, because obviously it's still kind of awkward and things like that. He said, that's where the breakdown happens. That's just one example of how this one breakdown about not going to your spouse first can devastate family relationships. Because most of the time what happens is I call my mom and says, well, Sarah's doing this again. It's driving me nuts. And that's all my mom hears. And what happens is there's a degrading of the relationship that's happening. You don't even realize it. Do you follow with me? I don't know if I'm making sense on that. But what happens is, in marriage, you've got to cut out the middleman. I know that sounds really crass because we're talking about our parents, but you have got to honor the spirit of Matthew 18, not just in general relationships, but in your marriage. It is always first. And I know sometimes you say, but what about these extreme situations? It's got to be real extreme for me to say it's not you going to them first. After that, maybe after your first conversation, then maybe you invite in mom and dad to offer a little perspective. But see, I go a step further and say, honor the perspective of your parents, but you also need to get back to returning to work out matters as a new and separate family. It still has always got to come back to this new family that has been formed in the eyes of God. But you got to keep honoring. Do you see the tension in this? It being complex. But it's a way to honor, make their way forward. I'm sure we could have a lot of conversations about a lot of different things, but I'll just close with this. Remember, this is the declaration of intent. You now leave your father and mother to establish your own home with bride as her husband, and make a home where she will be loved and cared for as long as God grants her life. If so, answer, I do. Good. You are cordially invited to do that. Bride, do you now leave your father and mother to establish your own home with groom as his wife, to make a home where he will be loved and cared for as long as God grants him life? If so, answer, I do. I do. Good. You are cordially invited to do that. For those of you who are parents, and who gives this woman to be married to this man? Her mother and I do. Good. You are cordially invited to do that. This is the beauty of marriage. It's discovering new ways forward as new families while also honoring that family who continues to speak grace and truth in your life. Follow with me? Am I making sense? If you could just nod, not just Heather Powell. Thank you, Heather Powell, though. It's affirming. Let me say a prayer.